Okay, so we learned yesterday that the witnesses should sign their name at the beginning of the line. They should that would be the optimal thing to do. They should make every effort to be within 2 lines of the. So that was what we saw yesterday. 2 lines of the body of the text. We talked about what is kosher as far as the way that they write their names. Optimally, it's supposed to be so-and-so ben so-and-so aid. Okay, now we're up to here in the middle of the Imrei Yaakov. Ein la'idim lachtom haksuva o shar shtar sheish bo kinyan, ela la'achar shekibel hachatan kinyan bifneihem. Witnesses are not permitted to sign the ketubah or any other shtar that involves transactional issue, like a promissory note or a bill of sale, unless they see the chassan makes the kinyan, which would mean him taking a handkerchief, lifting it up. That's what the witnesses have to witness. So these are all very useful for you if you're ever called upon to be an aid for a ksuva. The imlo kiblu kinyan klal v'chasmu kain haksuva psula. If there was no kabbalas kinyan, if the chassan never made a kinyan, and the witnesses just signed the ksuva, so then the ksuva is puzzle. It's not even a valid ksuva. You'd have to write a new one. Okay? The kaven denichtav b'ksuva v'kanina avale mezuyaf mitocha. And the reason is because since the ksuva says that the word v'kanina, what does the word v'kanina mean? It means a kinyan was transacted. And if there was no kinyan transacted, so then this is a forgery. You're signing on fraud. Okay? Vim kiblu kinyan achar hachasima yesh makom lahachshir b'di'evet. Let's say, for example, the witnesses sign, and the rabbi, who's the Masader Kiddushin, forgot to do a kinyan with the chatan. So he says that b'di'evet, you could perhaps argue that if you make a kinyan with the chatan after they sign, it's going to be kosher. The Tanai Shanasa HaKinyan Bo Bayom, provided that it's done the very same day, so that there's no predating of the shtar, like we learned yesterday. B'tzarachiyim, and this really requires further analysis. Avol Masha Nichtav B'ksuva Tevas V'kanina Kodem HaKinyan Ein Bo Kpeda. He says the fact that the word V'kanina appears in the ketubah before the kinyan was actually transacted is not a big deal. He says, provided that they sign it after the kinyan was made. So we should point out that there is such an opinion that states that you should fill in the word vikanina only after the kinyan was made. And that's why you may note that in certain ketubas, there's a blank for the space of vikanina. What's also done very commonly is that we leave off the leg of the letter kuf in the word vikanina. It looks like viranina, which doesn't mean anything. And then after the kinyan is transacted, the rabbi fills in the leg of the kuf. So that's generally done. And what he's pointing out is b'di'evet, if there was no filling in, if the whole word vikanina was already written and printed in the ketubah, not nishkaferlach, it's not a big deal. Okay. There is an argument that's made that you shouldn't write the word vikanina, a transaction has been made, until the actual transaction has actually been effected. The truth of the matter is that there's really nothing wrong with it, because this is only a legal document that is representative of truth once the witness is signed. But since in the old days, they would write the shtar out by hand completely, and you wouldn't want to write vikanina because it means a transaction has been made until the actual transaction was made. So that's why that became the minhag. It could be like you're saying, Mordechai, that it's actually important to do it as a reminder hey, make sure you don't let them sign before the kinyan is made. But I think there may be the first thing that I said is probably what was the original concern. Okay, next. So by the way, so as we all acknowledge, these halachos really aren't that pertinent today anymore for business law, but as you can see, they have pertinence for writing up a ketubah. That's really the most pertinent they would be for. Okay. So we had also said in the Rav Shulchan Aruch that v'im hirchiku kol kach hashtar pasol. He says if you have more than two full lines of blank space between the body of the shtar and the witnesses, then it's going to be pasol. Okay. He says v'im ze shtar shechasam b'chasimas yado v'hu atzmo hirchich chasimaso kamashurus misof hashtar. Yesh omim delo nifsal. He says, what if it's the person who's signing it is the person who wrote up the shtar to begin with, and you can tell it's his handwriting. So then some people say that that's not a problem, even if there's a lot of space between his signature and the handwriting. He says, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. He says, "V'im ze shtar shechasam b'chasimas yado, v'hu atzmo hichik chasimasu kamashurus misof hashtar." I'm sorry. Right. He says that if the witness can I think what it means is if the witness testifies that he knowingly distanced his signature from the body of the text. Some say that b'diavad it's kosher if he can testify that, and certainly if he wrote it in his own handwriting, the body of the shtar, it says avalim gama shtar nasa b'ksav yado kosher l'kul yalma kidul lekamen sif lamed zayin, as we'll see shortly. Okay, and then he writes. Then we saw in the Rav Shulchan Aruch ba'afilu kasuv sharir v'kayam b'siyam hashtar. He says. And with those two lines of blank space, the reason it's a problem is that even if the last line, right, has the words sharir v'kayam, yachol lemochko ulekayim hamachak b'shita shelifnei achrona v'yachzor v'yichtav sharir v'kayam b'shita achrona. He says because you could always erase that the word sharir v'kayam, and then you could say the last two words of the second to last line were written on erased parchment. Like there's always a way for you to forge it if too much space is left, is essentially what we said. He says, "Va'afilu yadua shelo hosif v'lo zif bo shum davar, va'afilu tiatuhu b'dio pasul." He says, this is a big chiddush. This I didn't know. That even if you know that the shtar has not been tampered with, there's nothing to indicate any tampering. Even if you fill in the blank two lines with ink, like you write lines, vertical lines, to show that there's been no opportunity to fill in any text, it's still puzzle. It's still puzzle, he says. Shelo yomru shechasimasan ba avur hatiyuta. So that people should not say that they were signing on those vertical lines. Klomar, shemi'idim shebifnehem naase hatiyuta pir she'aviru diol hakasuv u'mechakuhu al yedei zeh. That maybe what they did is that maybe the witnesses were only, in other words, it could be misleading. What if I called upon witnesses, sign here to demonstrate that we've crossed out or that we've put ink over this blank area, and maybe there was other text there that had been erased, and we put lines here to cover it up. And v'lo yachshdu es bal hashtar shemachak eze davar chiyav shu kasuv. Maybe the witnesses are just signing on that bottom stuff, and the witnesses are not aware that there had been previously things that were written in that space, and the person who asked them to sign is pulling a fast one, and he's asking them to sign, and they don't realize that that text had been erased. That's why he's putting ink blotches all over that area. And it turns out that they're not signing on the actual text. He's asking them, sign here to demonstrate that there was no erasure here before. So tiyuta, it really means to fill up the area with black ink. By filling up the area with black ink, you are suggesting the possibility that there had been text previously underneath. And then he brings that there's a machlokes. What if you just put dots? So it's clear that there was no text in that blank space. Or what if you just put lines or crisscrosses or X's or things like that? He says some say that that's not good, and some say that that will work. So basically, if you find yourself in a situation where there's a huge amount of blank space between the witnesses' signatures and the body of the text, the best advice we would give you in order to make the shtar kosher without any challenges is to put some dots or some other kind of design between the witnesses' signatures and the body of the text. And that way you sort of save it from being declared to be puzzle at any time in the future. Okay. So dots and lines are okay. What he was talking about originally, I mistranslated it. He's talking about filling up the whole thing with black ink. Yeah. So it's completely dark. A block of black ink there's more of a reason to suspect that some text was being covered up. That's right. That's right. Okay. Next. Okay. Sheet. Okay. Repta Lamed Gimel. Sheet in Elu Misharim B'Ksivus Yad Yedei Ha'idim Shehi Gasa V'Lo B'Ksav Yad HaSofer Shehu Ma'amenas Yadav L'Ksiva Daka. He says when we say that you can't have more than 2 lines of blank space, how big is a line? A line is based on the writing style of the witnesses, not the writing style of the scribe, because the scribe has greater mastery of his hand, so he can write small letters. But a witness who's not a professional scribe needs a little bit more space to write his signature. And as a result, it's got to be that there's 2 blank lines of lines that would be for witnesses to fill in the text. Because we can assume that if a person is going to forge a shtar and add additional text, he's not going to get it professionally done. Very few professional scribes are going to agree to participate in a forgery. Ela mizayef ba'atzmo, ve'eno yodea la'amin yadav l'ksiva daka kamo hasofer. And therefore, if we're going to suspect forgery, we're going to suspect forgery from a non-professional scribe. And therefore, we can allow for as much up to 2 lines of blank space, and lines would be measured by an unprofessional writer, not a professional writer. Okay. That's optimal, but the evidence, you could have changes in font size in any document, I think, except for a get. A get, we're much more machmir on all of these particulars. But we learned before that the font size and the font width should optimally be the same so as not to allow for forgery, but certainly b'diavad it's kosher. Okay. So in Kuf Nun Gimel, what does the Imrei Yaakov say? Shitin elu rod salamer madarin le'elsif lamed beishin tzrichem edim l'daktek When we said above that the witnesses have to be careful not to sign and leave two full lines of blank space, is we're talking about lines that are measured by non-professional writers. Because anyone who's going to commit forgery is not going to do it with a professional scribe. He says, because if a person were to go to a sofer, he says, because if a person were to go to a professional scribe, then even less than 2 lines, even 1.5 lines, would be problematic, because a scribe can really fit a lot of text in a small amount of space. And a scribe could write 2 full lines in a space that a normal person would. A scribe can fill in 2 full lines of text in an area where a normal person would only be able to fill in 1.5 lines, let's say. So he's just clarifying the point, but it's pretty self-evident. Let's go on to the next halacha. Shtar shekasav kulo kol edav b'shita echas kasher. Also, we were talking about, do the witnesses need to sign on 2 lines, on 1 line? We had learned yesterday, a little bit nebulous, but they said l'chatchila, it's always better for them to be on 2 separate lines. He says, b'di'evet, if a shtar was all written on 1 line, okay, it's all the text is on 1 line, and the witnesses sign on that same line, it's kosher. Kilo nasnu chachamim shir klal lagodel hashtar, because the rabbis never said how large a contract has to be. So if it says, Shimon owes Ruvain $1,000, signed Ruvain ben Yaakov, signed Shimon ben Yosef, okay? And it's all on 1 line. Totally kosher. Rabbis never said you had to have a minimum of X number of lines in a shtar. Aval im hashtar kulo b'shita echas, ve'edav b'shita acheres pasul. However, if the entire text of the shtar is on 1 line and the witnesses' signatures are on a 2nd line, then that's a problem. That's pasul. Kishema hayu chasumim al shtar acher v'lo tzimtzemu chasimasam biyad samach l'chtav. He says, here's what we suspect. Let's say these witnesses had signed a very long contract, and there was a little bit of space between the body of that old contract and their signatures. So what did a guy do? They left 1 line of blank space between that big contract and their signatures. And Ubal hashtar zeh chatach kol hashtar because of masharatza ba'osushita. And the contract holder that's coming forward with this little strip of parchment that says Shimon owes Reuven $1,000 with the signatures, he basically snipped off the bottom of the old shtar, filled in the blank line that was above their signatures, and now is presenting it to the Beis Din as an instrument of collection. Okay, the nimsu ha'idim chasumim alav. I can't believe how clever this is. In other words, like, you have to think about all of these contingencies. I wonder if these things actually happened. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. He says, and even if on this little strip of paper, there already is a line of blank space between the 1 line and their signatures, so you're going to say to yourself, well, how could a guy have gotten that? Because you can't have 2 blank spaces, 2 blank lines. No. The Chachamim made an across-the-board rule that a 1-line shtar with witnesses below that 1 line, that's not okay, because we're worried that it may have been a fraud. Yeah, right. If it's 2 or more lines, and then the signatures appear below, that's fine. Vafilu im eid echad chasam b'shita echas im ashtar, ve'echad chasam tachta b'shita acheres pasul, ki ein b'shtar zeh ela eid echad hachasam b'shita echas im ashtar, v'hasheni ein lamedim machasi masa. He says, what happens if you have a one-line star? Shimon owes Reuven $1,000, and you have the witnesses sign, but one witness signs on that same one line, and then the second witness signs below it. He says that's also no good. He says, because you can't derive anything from the second witness's signature. Kishema chasam al shtar acher. He says, because maybe that second signature on the second line was from a different shtar that was just snipped. Okay? Ubala shtar chasach kol ashtar. The kosav kol masharatza b'shitazu. And because maybe the guy is committing a forgery, he snipped off the entire old text, filled in this line, and vehechtim ba chasimas yad eid echad. And he was able to find one guy, one bozo, who was willing to sign his name to Shimon owes Reuven $1,000. Va'afsha eid omer shazu chasimas yado, ein eid echad neman lahotzi mama. And even if the witness says, no, this is my handwriting, I signed this because I saw the transaction, it's only one witness. You can't believe one witness's testimony. So that's the reason why a one-line shtar is not admissible in Beis Din if the witnesses are below the one line. Okay? Or even if one witness is below the one line. Okay, let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Lo chalku chachamim b'gzei rasam. The chachamim made a consistent rule that even if there is a blank space between that one line and their signatures, it's not acceptable. So he says, Azal l'shitaso le'el sif chavtes the pasuk asma, avoladas hashach yesh lahachshiro ein sham b'Imrei Yaakov d'iramas chol b'ze'ein. He says this actually is a machlokes. If you can tell from the circumstance that's being placed before you that there is a one-line shtar with one line of blank space, and then the witness's sign, he says, according to the Shach, that would be okay. Because it's unlikely that this was from a different shtar that was just snipped, because how would there ever be two lines of blank space? One line to write in the text of this new shtar, and one blank space, one blank line. So according to the Shach, that would be okay. But according to the Rav Shulchan Aruch, that would not be okay. All right, next. Lamed Hey. Lefichach. Kishiyesh gilyon b'shtar lefnei chasima sa'idim yachtamu ze tachazeh below ze eitzel ze b'shtar echad. He says it is for this reason that when you find space beneath the body of the shtar, kishiyesh gilyon b'shtar lefnei chasima sa'idim yachtamu ze tachazeh, that it is always preferred for the witnesses to sign one beneath the other and not one next to each other. Because it is subject to forgery. In other words, you're allowing for the possibility of forgery. Lachtoch kol hashtar, v'lichtov begilyon zeh, sheploni chayev lo sach sheyirtzeh. He says, because what you're doing is you're allowing for the possibility of counterfeiting. He says, because let's say someone were to come along, they see a whole shtar, it's a whole ketubah, let's say, and then there's some space, and then the witnesses sign. If they sign on the same line, someone could snip off the body of the ketubah, and then just write in that blank line that's above their signatures, Shimon owes Reuven $1,000. V'yihi yeshtar habahu ve'edav b'shita echad. And then it'll turn out, and the idea here is, what we're talking about, kishesh gilyon b'shtar lifnei chasima sa'idim. There's blank space before the witness's signature. What he's saying is that if two witnesses sign on the same line and there's a little bit of a margin before their signatures, it's potentially possible for a guy to snip off the entire top of the ketubah, let's say, right in that small margin. Shimon owes Reuven $1,000, signed, two witnesses all on the same line. He says, and that's going to be the possibility of forgery. The chol shtar sheyuchal lizdayef pasul, and any shtar that could be forged is not kosher. Afal pi shelo nizdayef, even though it hasn't yet been forged. In other words, if you see a shtar that is theoretically subject to forgery, then you're not allowed to sign it. And if even when you sign it, a beis din may come and declare that it's pasul because it's so easy to forge it. V'im hashtar mistayem be'emtza shita yachnemu ha'edem b'chatzi shita hanishar ze etzel ze below ze tachat ze. He says, now that's true when the body of the shtar ends at the end of the line. The bottom line of the shtar ends at the end of the line. What happens if the bottom of the shtar ends in the middle of the line and there's room for the two witnesses to sign on that line? He says that actually would be preferred for them to sign one adjacent to the other. He says, and not to sign below the shtar in that circumstance. Shekesheyachtamu zeh tachazeh yitztarchu lahachzir mi'inyano shel shtar levad b'chatzi shita achrona. He says, because if they're going to sign one below the other, it will be necessary to do a summation in that last half line. V'chol hashita shelefaneha ki lo yilmedu mehen shum zuchut sheino kasuv lamayla. Ki shema henichu ha'edim kedei rochav shita shelo yachlu litzamtzem u'v'shita shniya hitchilu lachtom be'emtza'ah. He says what you have to suspect is that in a situation like that, is that maybe the witnesses left some space between their signatures and the body of the text, and somebody filled in added text afterwards. And then in the second line, they started to sign in the middle of the line. She'ein shum chashash bazeh sheyish gilyon lifnei chasimasen k'shechos min zeh tachazeh u'balashtar kosev masharatza b'shita u'mechzazu. He says, what if the witnesses will sign one below the other, then you're allowing the possibility for forgery, because you may have a full line and a half of text that can be filled in. Aval keshechot min zeh etzel zeh b'chatzi ashtar hanishar ein tzorach lahachzir mi'inyano shel shtar afilu b'chatzi shita hachrona u'lameidin mimena kol zechut shekasuv ba. He says, but if the witnesses fill in their signatures on that half line of blank space, then we know that it's not forgerable, and they don't have to fill in anything. She'ein lachush klal shebal ashtar hosif zeh she'ein idem rishayim laniach chalak lifnei chatimatam keshechot min zeh etzel zeh. And essentially, I guess he's saying that there's much less of a fear of forgery in that situation. So just to clarify, the Imrei Yaakov explains what's going on over here. Kesheyesh gilyon, pira sheyesh niyar mitzad yamin lifnei tchilat chatimatan she'efshir lichtov sham. There's a margin, is what he means. That's what the word gilyon over here means. When there's a right margin, and the witnesses are signing, they should sign one below the other, so that you don't leave the opportunity for two witnesses' signatures, one next to each other, and someone to put in some text in that margin and just have a one-line shtar. As af im yatchilu lachtom berosh hashita dainu tachat hatchalat hashita shemei aleihem mikol makom hol v'yesh gilyon lifnei hatchalat chatimatam sheisham chalak harbei. He says because even if the witnesses are signing using the same margin of the body of the text that's above them, but a person could always snip off the top of the text, use the margin to fill in his own stuff. The kol shekain de lo yachtemu ze eitzel ze v'yatchilu chatimatan be'emtza shita behai time. And certainly, witnesses should not sign next to each other and begin their signatures in the middle of the line, because that certainly could create the possibility of a forgery. Okay, sheyachol lezayev. Okay, so we'll hold it here for today. We'll continue Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Okay. There's no standardized size of the paper either.